Well, thank you, everyone. And I've been a happy customer at the Strand for years and years, and I never even knew about the rare books room. So I'm happy to see it. And I'm wondering if I can find anyone to be a radiation monitor, just for a minute or two. Yeah, sure, yeah. So let's see. All right, I'm going to put this on a 1 minute time count. And if you can, just walk around for a minute, and then when it's finished, bring it up here and we'll see what it says.
I just have to hold it and not touch it.
That's right, yeah. Okay, all right.
So just walk around?
Yeah, just walk around, sample the air, or whatever it is you want. I don't know if you folks, yeah, the books, that'd be good. If you had a chance to look at those handouts, just to make you feel even more dreary about a dreary subject. Let's talk about this, this scale for a second. Carbon Ideologies is about, among other things, corporate malfeasance. And it doesn't matter whether it's nuclear or oil or natural gas or coal, but what we often find is that there's a big company that is cutting corners for the sake of profit. Oh, thank you very much. We have about 45 counts per minute, which is probably about 0.002 microsieverts, a very, very reassuringly low reading. What happened at Fukushima was that TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, was trying to save a few yen, and so they could have put their emergency backup generators way up high so the tsunami couldn't have wiped them out. They decided that was too expensive. They didn't expect that the tsunami would be as tall as it was. And I actually have to say that of all of the various fuel resource companies that I have dealt with, I like TEPCO the best because they actually agreed to meet with me and discuss the accident with me. In West Virginia, the coal and chemical cowboys refer to themselves as the regulated community. And they're very, very bitter about any sort of regulation. I tend to think of all of these companies as being part of the regulated community. No one wants to be regulated. You know, I have a very low tolerance for authority. I don't like being regulated either. TEPCO thought that they could get away with it without regulation. One of the things that is generally not known about nuclear power is that it takes a lot of fossil fuels. First, you have to mine the uranium, then you have to enrich it, and then you need this backup power all the time. So the backup power is usually powered by coal or oil or something of the sort. So after the tsunami came and wiped out all the electric power, the fuel rods started to heat up, and that's what caused the disaster in 2011. I went to Fukushima off and on from 2011 through early 2017. And it wasn't until mid-2014 that I had this device. If you ever go to any sort of contaminated area, which may be coming to you before you know it. What you want is not only something like this, which can tell you that this place is very dangerous and this place isn't, but you also need a dosimeter to keep track of your total accrued dose. And if you have those things, you'll be okay. Now, let's just briefly go over this radiation scale for a second before I read. So a sievert is a unit of biological damage. One sievert will cause radiation sickness for sure. 10 sieverts will definitely kill you. A millisievert is 1,000th of a sievert, and people often say, okay, you can get so many millisieverts per year. A microsievert is 1,000,000th of a sievert, or 1,000th of a millisievert. And in California, my dose is about 1.4 or 1.3 micros a day. So if you look on the left-hand side of that chart, you see some multipliers. The first one is a 1. That was the level at my studio. This is in microsieverts per hour. If you look down, you'll see a 95. That's the lower limit of the Japanese red zone. They have green zones, decontaminate with priority, yellow zones in between green and red, which is basically you don't come back. They call it, politely, a difficult to return zone. So 145 was my highest reading in the town of Itata. I'm going to be reading about Itata today. And then if you look a little farther down, 1585 was the measured level in Itata shortly after the reactors failed. And then if you look down at the very bottom, there's a sievert, so 11.67 million times, what I would get at my studio. The only other thing I should tell you about this chart is, in a way, it's comparing apples and oranges. If you see the second to the last figure, 100 micros an hour, that's the value for a chest x-ray, or one value. But it's actually less dangerous than the measured level in Itata, which is slightly less. And the reason is that you get one chest x-ray and you're done. But in Itata, that was the gift that kept on giving. So it was like getting x-rays hour after hour after hour. Sooner or later, that's going to kill you. All right, let's see. Just a couple other things. Onigiri are flavored rice balls. The NRA in Japan is not this. It's the Nuclear Regulation Authority. The black bags contain radioactive waste, and you see them everywhere now. Sabi is pleasant decrepitude, and a yen is very, very roughly equivalent to a cent. So I'm going to read to you now an account of the first time I went into a red zone with the pancake frisker. And it was by no means the worst of the red zones, but it had the most human interest because there was actually somebody there. And so this is called No Crime in Nagadoro. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Although Itata village lay a good 40 kilometers from plant number 1 and might have been expected to be as safe as anywhere on the outer ring, the place proved unfortunate in its winds. Perhaps this was the case which persuaded the Japanese government to replace that convenient system of the 2 rings with a more realistic fallout map. It was another combined village, like Tomioka. We took one sound from each included area to make this name. First, 4 villages became 2, Odata and Iso. So we took I and Tata, explained a man from Iso. The two towns had joined 30 years ago, he said, or maybe 50. The pre-accident population of Tomioka had been 16,000 at most. As for Itata, in 2016, someone mordantly remarked, there every day, 7,500 workers are decontaminating the village where 6,500 lived. Itata apparently received its first cesium, iodine, and tellurium in a snowfall after the explosion of reactor number 3. It was the most distant of the 10 localities to be blessed from plutonium by the accident. Okama, Minamisoma, and Namiya also got improved in this way. I remember in 2011 watching the weather reports on Japanese television. Itata always figured in them. Some of its sub-districts grew more contaminated than others, Nagadoro being the most dangerous, which is why it owned the lonely distinction of being a red zone. Mr. Shigehara Yoshitomo, the man from Iso, was the head of Nagadoro. He had once been a welder. His household had contained 6 persons, including 2 grandchildren. On his dairy farm, there had been 4 breeding cows and 3 calves, all sold on June 22, 2011. He wrote that on March 15, 2011, when they were making rice balls, the radiation level was 44.7 micros an hour, slightly higher than my own worst reading in Fukushima. A day later, it was 49, and the day after that, it had reached 95.1. On April 6th, a Mr. Takamura found 28,000 becquerels from soil in Nagadoro. Come the end of that month, the government announced that radiation accumulation in Nagadoro now exceeded 20 millisieverts. That was a trick that the Japanese government loves to play, mixing all these units so you can't figure out what's what. At that time, people were still allowed to stay in their homes, but not to eat what they had planted. As for the cattle, eventually they slaughtered nearly 3,000 head. All the same, everyone in Itata had remained, in Mr. Shigehara's words, free to come and go for 14 months after the accident. At the end of May 2012, compulsory evacuation measures fell upon them. Each of the Nagadoro people was to receive 6 million yen a year for 5 years. When Mr. Shigehara told me this, I remarked on the difference between his compensation and Mr. Endo's from Tomioka, for the latter got nothing, his house being insufficiently damaged by the tsunami. Mr. Shigehara replied, the government policy is to isolate all the evacuees. If they are too powerful, they are against the government. At the beginning, we were all united against TEPCO, but not now. His family left home on June 22nd. On July 17th, Nagadoro became a no-go zone. Mr. Shigehara believed that the subdivision of contaminated areas into red, yellow, and green further separated the people from each other. On July 4th, a whole body counter found his exposure of Cesium-134 to be 1,200 becquerels. He also bore 1,400 becquerels of Cesium-137. How badly was he poisoned? At Chernobyl, a certain colonel who died from his injuries is said to have received 600 becquerels, evidently on a single overflight of the reactor. And from this context, it appears to have been a very high level of irradiation. But I should note that the colonel made many other flights. Hence, this dose might not have been lethally carcinogenic in and of itself. At any rate, Mr. Shigehara's 1,400 becquerels could scarcely have been good news. By 2013, he had begun to wonder whether decontamination were even possible. In a typescript which he prepared at that time, he noted the immense amount of time it required to decontaminate a place. In addition, he wrote, the resulting radiation level decrease is only to half. Here are some other thoughts from that sad document. What hurts me most is that I left my grandchildren exposed to radiation. I often say, the truth will be revealed when my grandchildren have babies. This is unbearable. I feel we are being tamed. There is no dream or hope. Nagadoro residents and Fukushima people are all supposed to be angry. I don't really like social movements, but after experiencing this, I now think that we need to voice against what we think is wrong. My house was built when I was a child, carrying logs from the mountains, and construction took 2 years. After all these years, you can't easily leave the village, which was constructed through our ancestors' efforts, generation after generation. His young son announced that he would never turn to Nagadoro. The same went for his grandchildren. Saying that she could not imagine life without them, his wife informed him that in that case, she would not go back either. Mr. Shigehara said, "So I thought, there is no point for me to return there alone. Think about it. Why do people gather and hold festivals at the shrine? Why do they dance? What is their home? I can't well explain myself, but perhaps gratitude to the ancestors, I realized for the first time after I left my home. It is like you appreciate your parents only after they die." That September, he measured the levels again, reading 5 to 7 microsieverts at the Nagadoro intersection, 4 to 6 micros both in front of and inside his house, and 8 to 15 micros in his rice field and vegetable garden. The latter two readings, he noted, had certainly fallen off. I was to meet him on October 23, 2014. On the 22nd, at 4:30 in the afternoon real time, according to the Nuclear Regulation Authority website, which a lovely Japanese angel accessed for me, it had transpired that of Itata's 40 monitoring posts, the highest official value was the senior high school at 2.338 micros per hour. The junior high school was the merest 1.441. There even appeared to be a few 0 points in the yellow zone. Then the angel's cursor froze up. Certain station values did not appear. Should I have labeled that human error, or was it the machine kind? As it happened, 2.33 micros was an understatement. Shall I say that the NRA lied, or simply that certain unmentionable things happened? On that cool afternoon of light gray, rainy sky, and dark gray concrete buildings, it came time to consider the practicalities of one's painter suit and half-face dust mask, which was recommended for use against harmless dusts only. One also carried the shoe covers and blue gloves at the ready. The 23rd was a gray morning. I wondered if it were drizzling. Then a cyclist rode by with uncovered head, overflown by 2 crows. The next thing I wondered was whether sunscreen would adhere alpha and beta particles to my skin, or in fact keep them from blowing down inside my clothes. Unable to guess, I skipped the sunscreen. The dosimeter read 0.571 millisieverts accrued over more than a year in Tokyo, the usual micro a day, or very rarely 2. Before tonight, several more digits might turn over. The railroad clock displayed 11.9 degrees Celsius at 8 a.m. The bulky, jolly, head-shaved taxi driver sped us over the half-dry river. He said, "I don't mind about the radiation. It's the younger ones who have to worry." And so we arrived at the apartment block. Mr. Shigehara was a round-headed grandfather with very short spikes of gray hair. He said, "It hurts me when they say that radiation causes mutation. It hurts me that the government evacuated Okuma and Futaba, but not Itata. They first said that even 10 microsieverts per hour was no problem at all. At our community center, it was 15 or 17. To his young-looking wife, I offered to frisk anything in their abandoned place that she might wish to have with her, but she calmly replied that the neighbors would be too frightened if it came out that she had brought back anything from there. She served tea. They seemed to be a loving couple. Their story had a typical village beginning. Her family's home had been only 1.5 kilometers away from his. I thought it kindness not to inquire what had happened to her parents. Mr. Shigehara remarked that the Nagadoro people hardly kept in touch anymore. People from Okuma and Futaba, 70% of them are in the same place. From Itata, they are spread all around because the other places are evacuated right away, and by the time we were told to leave, no good facilities were left. We got in his car, and I turned on the pancake frisker, the merest 55 counts per minute, a little higher than here, but not much, 0.18 micros. That was higher than Tokyo and San Francisco, but lower than Singapore. I asked what he used to do when he was a boy. We went after birds. There were no toys, you know, no swings. We made swings using big ropes. We played marbles. We just went into the mountains to make charcoal. At that time, we didn't grow much rice, evidently for lack of flatlands. So mountain jobs were more important. Forestry keeps you busy for the whole year. And we were winding up into the mountains, paralleling the sparkling gray-green river. We would sell the charcoal for cash, he said. You put the charcoal on the back of a horse and you walk 30 kilometers. That was what we did until the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. Then we started to go to other cities to work. In Itata, we earned 400 yen per day, and in Tokyo, we could get 2,500 yen per day. From January to March, there was nothing to do. That was when people went away. We passed steep rock outcroppings, higher than in West Virginia. There were lush banana trees, rainy sky, high round hills of yellow-green forest. I wondered how contaminated they were. After the Olympic Games, there was a company set up in Itata to make electrical parts, he was saying. Women worked there and also in a garment factory. When did you first hear that nuclear power was coming near you? 40 years ago. I was about 20. That was when I heard about it. At that time, Itata village was against it, but we had no say since the plant was more than 30 kilometers away. Futaba and Okuma received many subsidies, but we got nothing. He might or might not have been a jealous soul, but he paid most definite attention to what he and his were given in relation to others. He said, in my opinion, the people who benefited would like to go back by any means, but I think they should compromise a little bit. My grandchildren can't go back. I saw bamboo and something like honeysuckle and a few trees turning yellow. The government says they are going to make a facility for temporary storage. I think temporary and final storage should be the same, he said. Whom do you blame? The government and nationalists, including me. I personally don't feel responsible, but everybody blames TEPCO and the government alone, and that's wrong. Our parents, the earlier generation, they accepted it. Everybody, including me, is responsible. The government shows the least intention to be responsible. It doesn't even want to decide threshold radiation levels for whenever we should go back to Itata. They say we should decide it because they're just trying not to take responsibility. When do you think your home will be safe? The head of the NRA, Mr. Tanaka, he came to my house to carry out an experimental decontamination. At that time, he said it would take at least 20 years. It was as if he were talking to himself. It won't be good in 20 years. He added, around then, the front of my house read 8 micros an hour. Mr. Tanaka said they will make it 1/10, but they only reduced it by 50%. That made him so disappointed. And we were passing through the high town of Kawabata, whose cemetery steles glittered on the hills. Just here, in the car at least, the radiation was as low as my kitchen back home. Up here, we used to sell charcoal, he said. The dosimeter remained constant. We passed a field of scarlet maples rolling uphill past the terraces. He said, I believe that if the nature is beautiful, then even if the living level is economically lower, it's still a better life. There is no name for the road, he said. We are almost at the border of Itata. Suddenly, we were in a forest of cryptomeria and pine, which to me appeared quite wild, although Mr. Shigehara said it had been planted only some 30 years ago. He said, "I don't wear a mask, nothing. The government, I don't see many of them wearing masks." At 9:49, we passed a sign that said, "Itata Village." "This is the best week of the year for color," he said. "You're lucky." And doubtless I was, although the pancake frisker was distracting me from my good luck, for almost immediately as we descended into the town limits, the 1-minute timed reading I obtained there in the back seat grew significant, displaying 226 counts per minute and 0.78 micros per hour. Were I to set up housekeeping around here, this level would present me with nearly 7 times the international recommended annual civilian dose. But since our tour was intended to last no longer than 3 or 4 hours, I felt no unease just yet. My venerable incident guide for nuclear first responders had set the worry threshold at a full 1 micro. But I did feel incumbent on me to pay attention, insofar as our situation was not invisible. What truly did I have but the frisker, the dosimeter, which had not yet turned over a single digit that day, and Mr. Shigehara's experience? "The fields are damaged by wild boar," he was saying. And just then I was too occupied in writing down radiation measurements to look. But presently he pointed again. He was a lonely old man whose thick Itata dialect, which sometimes baffled the interpreter and others, further isolated him, which might have been why he often repeated himself. And I saw how parts of the green, abandoned fields had been pawed down to black dirt. They eat worms inside the soil and also roots. That's why they dig. You see them early in the morning. In normal mode, the frisker was chittering between 1.0 and 1.1 micros an hour, the average 2015 air dose for Itata, 8 to 16 times higher than my hometowns, after which it plunged to 0.5, then 0.6, where it stayed for a moment, then chirped to 0.7 and 0.8. In other fields, decontamination workers were servicing those horrid black bags. Some wore half masks and others let them hang around their throats. Asking Mr. Shigehara to stop the car, I walked up to the security rope around a neat army of bags and thrust out the frisker, 1 to 2 micros only. A quarter of an hour later, we had reached the gate in the empty road where stood the sentry, who must be getting his innards tanned in recompense for controlling access to the red zone. He made a fine impression on me, that white helmeted guard before the red zone of Itata, with the paper half mask tucked under his eyes and his gloved hands crossed and characters marching down his white suspenders. "See, this guy has been here for 3 years, Mr. Shigehara said. I wonder why the government doesn't care about him." The inevitable day when we Americans experienced our own true nuclear disaster would bring about our own national kamikalities. The perimeters of our forbidden zones would be patrolled by self-important federal police officers or their bully hirelings. Some national agency would have all the authority, the locals would have none. In Japan, of course, it did not work like that. Mr. Shigehara was, as you know, the head of Nagadoro Subdistrict, a position which must have been less powerful than that of the village mayor, while the man at the gate, so I would have thought, had the whole central government at his back. Mr. Shigehara remarked that, as a matter of fact, he was only permitted to bring in journalists on the first and third Sundays, and this was a Thursday. But the guard asked no questions, checked no papers. Withdrawing the central bolt from the 2-section metal gate, he swung the pieces apart, and in we drove. I liked that. It had come time to use the normal mode more frequently, in order to save myself and companions from long minutes of being frozen in place while getting irradiated. So that is what I did. The frisker churred quite busily, displaying 4 or 5 micros an hour, and once in a while even 6. 6 microsieverts. Now, that was 100 times higher than what I got on the Amtrak train in California. Still, it wasn't all that bad compared to the 95.1 that Mr. Shigehara had experienced on March 17, 2011. Just now, the frisker read 5.71 micros. That would be 50 millisieverts if it went on for a year. Mr. Shigehara saw me checking my dosimeter. In disgust, he said, "If you have 10 of them, the results are all different." We arrived at Whitebird Shrine, and I asked to get out and measure. Where we parked, a 1-minute timed count measured 2.94 microsieverts per hour. He bitterly disdained to wear a mask, and I saw him watching me, so I did not put mine on either. And that is how I fell into bad habits in the red zones. Since he was willing to expose himself for my sake, I would rather take chances with my health than offend him. The interpreter wore her mask in Okuma and sometimes in Tomioka. Not today. So nobody put on anything, not even shoe covers. It was a driest day with particles blowing in the faint breeze. Trying to play it cool, I asked what the shrine was dedicated to. "This is to be grateful for the harvest," he said. "I would like to say thank you." He pointed out 2 votive figures. The one on the right had been erected because no villagers got killed by Americans during World War II. I checked the dosimeter again. "People see these values and they get pale," he said, "but we come here every 3 days." I read 3 micros beneath the torus. We ascended the front steps and the level climbed to 4. I wished I had had the pancake frisker when I was standing at the ruined shrine in Tomioka with Mr. Endo. "In the past, we used to sing together and dance together," said Mr. Shigehara. "This stone lantern came down. We fixed everything last year." There had been moderate damage from the big quake. He showed me the new plaque with his name and others on it to commemorate the repair. They had paid for the stone, then laid it in themselves, hired laborers being expensive and afraid. I decided to explore the place's radioactivities. Mr. Shigehara stood by the interpreter while I began to climb, and what I later most remembered from Itata, after the bright red berries and lovely geraniums and all the other bright flowers of so many colors, each of them radioactive in its own way, was ascending that steep and narrow flight of shrine steps up through the darkness of the pine and cryptomeria trees, my shoes sinking into the softness of reddish-brown cryptomeria needles on those long, unswept steps, so that I wondered how contaminated they would be. Holding the frisker before me like a torch, toggled to normal, so that its numerical flickerings would keep me updated to poisonous realities, I watched the readings go steeply up, from 3 microsieverts per hour to 4 to 5, as my head grew closer to those hideous branches. Hideous, of course, only because the frisker made them so, and because I, an occasional sufferer from tree allergens in my hometown, have sometimes felt myself sneezing or even choking when I passed directly beneath a pollen-raining branch. I could not help but wonder whether in this enclosed space alpha and beta particles might be likewise sifting down to tickle my lungs with carcinogenic scintillations. But near the top of the steps, the ceiling of that tunnel of branches finally drew off from me a trifle, and the frisker began to chirp more slowly. The decrepit shrine stood right ahead of me now, so I climbed up to it. 3 micros, then 2, then 3 again. In spite of my creeping anxiety about the radiation, I paused on the topmost step to take a 1-minute time count, 721 counts per minute, or 2.4 micros per hour. Well, so what? On one of my transcontinental business flights out of Washington, D.C., cruising altitude 36,000 feet, the frisker had read 730 CPMs and 2.46 micros. So, aside from the issue of inhalable particles, standing here was no more unsalubrious than airplane travel, which hardly anyone worried about. Presently, Mr. Shigehara and the interpreter came up after me. He bowed and thanked the god for the land, the ancestors, and everything. I do not remember whether he clapped. He left no coins. On the way down, he asked me if I were a Christian, and I said that I liked to express gratitude for my life. He approved of that. He said he did much the same. The dosimeter turned over another digit, another microsievert in my body. Down at the first torus, the air dose had reached 5 micros an hour. As we departed, Mr. Shigehara said, "Sometimes foreigners ask me why we don't riot. It's very difficult to make an action. I wouldn't do anything myself, I know that's not a good thing, but that's reality. I just can't. We stopped at the carp pond, where he came every 3 days. There were no fish in sight. When I checked my exposure, he said, "Your dosimeter is just for your peace of mind. No one will tell me what is safe, so it's good for nothing." All the same, he kept pulling out his own scintillation counter. Driving past another field torn up by wild boar, he said, "The monkeys eat chestnuts and persimmons. Over here is my land." At an abandoned intersection, probably the one mentioned in his writings, a red cross had been painted on the road to mark the point of highest radioactivity at some prior period. They used to come every day to measure, and now they come every week, he said bitterly. The pancake frisker was reading 4.8 and 4.9 micros. "Look at this," he shouted, and from the log box pulled out the radiation records. "March 17th, 95.1 microsieverts an hour. We were making onigiri here." I supposed that if I had lived through such terrifying levels, I might have repeated myself also, wondering all the while how long I would walk this earth before the radiation caught me out. Calming me down, he said, "You're not supposed to be walking here anyway, prohibited to ordinary people, but it's nothing." The rusty leaves on the tree behind the community center, the "Do Not Enter" sign on the blacktop at the intersection, the cloudy sky and the moss on graven stones made for a fine post-human picture. I walked around and measured 0.48 micros an hour, the same as a Ten Commandments granite tablet in front of a courthouse in Pineville, West Virginia. That had been the highest reading I got in the eastern United States. Doubtless I could have fished around for radon in Connecticut basements, but why bother when Itata put them to shame? Although it was not so bad, I found myself trying not to breathe too deeply of the fresh, chilly air. It was quite still. There were blue shadows on the rolling green hills. Yellow leaves twitched. On the hood of the car hunched a very strange butterfly, grayish-orange and asymmetrical. I asked if he had ever seen one like it. "No," he said angrily, "but don't write that it's a mutant because of the radiation." That was one of his bêtes noires. At his temporary home back in Fukushima City, I had asked him, meaning no harm, to point out any plant or animal abnormality for me to photograph, since the only other two ways for me to represent the radiation visually were to record abandoned decrepitude or photograph the numerical display of the pancake frisker. He grew almost enraged. It seemed that he had conceived the idea that documenting mutations was the trivializing or even sadistic entertainment of journalists. Not wishing to provoke him, I dropped the subject, and I made a point of not photographing the deformed butterfly. 2 years later, a Greenpeace study of the disaster found heritable mutations in pale bluegrass butterfly populations. Driving away from the community center, we encountered mild weather, about 1 microsievert an hour. When we reached his land, the frisker was reporting 1.8 micros, because exactly here, the forces of good had established their usual multitudes of black bags. And on that green field now cut into berms and terraces, white-clad figures strode mysteriously yet purposefully, with a bulldozer and crane behind them and clouds in the lovely sky. A big man in knee-high boots was standing at the lip of the well they had made, with his feet spread wide and his gloved hands hanging loose. A slender young woman whose white suit was too big for her stood facing him, bowing her half-masked face as if waiting to receive some order. From behind the white hard hat, her rich black hair fell loose across her shoulders. I wondered how radioactive it was. And Mr. Shigahara stood in the middle of the empty road, calling out to them. I went up to measure a black bag, and the reading went down to 0.5 micro. Mr. Shigahara laughed at me. He explained that the outer rows consisted of sandbags. I could have crawled onto the real black bags, but somehow I didn't want to. Come to think of it, back when I was alive, it always put me out whenever I had to irradiate my testicles. Mr. Shigahara stood chatting with the smiling and laughing decontamination workers, none of whom were now wearing masks. As they said, alpha and beta could not get out of the bags. Aside from Mr. Shigehara himself, they were the only human beings I saw in Nagadoro. I strolled across the deserted highway, frisking weeds, flowers, and pampas grass. They read 1, 2, and 3 micros. The fallen leaves made a sweetly pre-radioactive sight. As they decomposed, they would emit ammonia, which is known to draw cesium from the soil and make it more absorbable by plants. We drove up the side road to his house, which he predicted would read 1.2 micros inside. They had decontaminated his rain gutters to about 4. They had taken 5 centimeters from topsoil around the house and pruned one of his favorite trees nearly to death. He still felt cross about that. It must have been a pleasant home once. Even now it appeared far more livable than anything else I had seen in the red or yellow zones. There was a pond, a dairy barn, a rich-looking pasture, and many trees. Mr. Shigehara had been prosperous. The house itself remained in excellent repair. Pulling out his own counter, he stood in the driveway, then said, "The lowest reading yet." I took my own measurement, 1.14 micros. If the radiation remained at that level, staying here might be no worse than working as an airline stewardess. Where was all the cesium going? I am guessing that a great deal of those 95.1 micros, which had afflicted this place in 2011, derived from iodine-131, whose 10 half-lives of dwindling to 1,000th strength would have already elapsed by early June of that year. As for the cesium, whose ability to spread itself at significant distance from the locus of any atomic explosion was infamous. Being the decay product of certain radioactive gases, it could travel high and quickly on any nuclear wind. It probably made up the bulk of Itata's present radiation burden. The 2.5 years since the reactor failures comprised a mere 12% of cesium-134's first half-life and 8% of cesium-137's. It must still be causing wickedness somewhere. His grandchildren's portrait hung on the wall. I frisked the air in front of it. It was only 1.08 micros. Sitting there on the floor in his house, he seemed to have become younger. This was his place, and for a few minutes his lost world reorganized itself around him. When we went out, he puttered across one of his fields almost happily. He had a camera set up to record night visitors. He showed me photos of the monkeys and wild boar that had visited. When I asked how often he found sick or dead animals, he answered, as people from the red zones always did, that no creatures showed any signs of harm. His back window measured almost 4 micros, but the rest of the house never registered much over a single micro, 20% of what he had measured the year before. Again, I was curious about the mystery of the disappearing cesium. Pursuing this question, I asked Mr. Shigehara whether he would let me dig a hole in his field, maybe over there beneath the big tree. He was hospitable. He lent me a shovel. The air dose was nowhere near the 8 to 12 micros he had measured 13 months ago in his pasture, and over his pond I could only find 3 to 4 micros. He and the interpreter stood back as I began to dig, perhaps because they entertained considerations of radioactive dust. They continued to refrain from masking their faces, so I followed suit. As I dug, I frisked. The topsoil was about 3 micros. From 6 inches to a foot deep, the levels went up from 3 to 4, then 4.5 to 5, after which they began to fall off again. At 2 feet, they read 3 micros. Happy to reinter what my old chemistry textbook used to call an extremely active member of the sodium family, I shoveled the dirt back in and thanked Mr. Shigehara. He said, "Many people came to Itata to evacuate. I thought it was safe. About 1,000 of our self-defense forces were here, and suddenly they had to go. The American government policy was 80 kilometers from the reactor. I've heard the American soldiers are suing." I wandered into the reddish-brown dimness of his dairy barn, where a small, bright window of tree light bestowed on it some of the tones of an Andrew Wyeth painting. The walls were a little mossy and maybe moldy. Nothing looked amiss. The cows could have come home at any minute, and the levels varied between 3 and 4.3. Then I elongated my arm, I don't know why, and the frisker chittered up to 8.7 micros, the highest reading I got in Itata. After that, the place felt less inviting, and I hastened out of there. By now, the dosimeter had turned over 2 digits, so we had absorbed 2 micros. I had asked to visit the village's most beautiful places, which of course meant the cherry trees of Itata, which were green mossed on their dark trunks and branches, almost but not entirely leafless, 7 months out of bloom, growing out of the wet grass and ferns on a hill, where, as Mr. Shigahara pointed out, we could see all the way to the ocean, which meant that cesium-laden ocean breezes had a straight path to that hill. And indeed, it was somewhat radioactive, 3 and 4 micros by the cherry tree. Higher up, I took another measurement, 6.7 miles. Then I drew back the frisker, and it meant 5.8. There must have been gamma rays about, a fine indication of cesium, because the level inside Mr. Shigahara's car had tripled to 3 or 4 micros an hour. And though it occurred to me that we might have let in too much fallout as a result of all the times we had opened the door, in the end, my cesium hypothesis seemed the most plausible. For as soon as we departed the red zone, the radiation inside the car dropped by itself all the way back to 1.3. So there must not have been many conspicuously irradiating particles riding with us. Amidst the dark, green-splotched curvature of Idata's cherry branches, Mr. Shigahara stood looking out at the slit of ocean and said, "For Fukushima City people, it was lucky. We were sacrificed, but other people were saved. So we asked for more help. Futaba and Namiya suffered a lot, but they evacuated before the explosion, while we kept being told, no problem, no problem." Now it was time to go. We drove out through another gate. The radiation field dwindled, and then we were back in Greater Itata, which was merely a yellow zone, with islands and continents of black bags going on and on. None of the ones I could reach with my frisker read more than 1.5 micros. Where would those bags finally go? 2 months ago, after what I was told had been strenuous negotiations, the prefectural governor of Fukushima finally granted consent for the central government to store contaminated debris for 30 years in exchange for 301 billion yen. The politicians of Tokyo decreed that each radio-poisoned prefecture must find somewhere to store black bags within its own borders. And so a local headline ran, "Tochigi Town protests nomination as atomic dump site." Fortunately, Shioya Prefecture was also a candidate. How lucky for Shioya. At last, we came out onto Highway 399, leaving Itata, the dreary armies of black bags bivouacked in mud, with green fields all around, and the dosimeter accrued another digit. Mr. Shigahara said, "How I like to pass the time is have a draft beer and talk about Itata." So that was more or less what we did. He said, "Evacuees, they are suffering, but at the same time, they are the objects of envy from those who do not get any subsidy. That hurts us." He said that 30 out of Nagadoro's 70 households had already purchased real estate in Fukushima City. I think that made him feel pretty hopeless. Lean, active Mr. Shigahara, who despite his gray-fringed baldness had the bright eyes and mobile mouth of a younger person, liked to keep busy. He must have been a conscientious farmer back when he had a farm. He patrolled the red zone every 3 days. I asked him if he encountered any crime, and he reassured me that there was no crime in Nagadoro. Thank you. I can take some questions if you want, and also, if anyone's interested, I have heard that the Headless Horseman is a very non-radioactive bar, and I would be happy to go there and talk about millisieverts and becquerels and all that stuff, or just have a drink with anyone. So Any questions?
We have time for just maybe 2 for now before we move on to the signing. Or we could do the signing now. Seems
Sure.
like that's the consensus. Oh, one, never mind.
Yes.
You're really specific. Oh, yeah. You're really specific with the amounts of radiation that you were encountering at each point. Just out of curiosity, what kind of notes were you taking to accompany that? How specific you are throughout?
I had a notebook, and I was scribbling as fast as I could. When the frisker is in normal mode, it constantly changes. Let's see here. I can show you. It'll start moving all over the place. I don't know if you can see that, but I'll show you later if you like. And so all you get is the reading of that second. And in a very low field, such as what we have here, the readings are a little bit less accurate. But the more radiation, the more consistent it is. And as I said, I didn't want to do the 1-minute time count too often, which is what our radiation monitor did for us here, because you're standing around getting irradiated. So I was just scribbling away as fast as I could. And I know it probably is quite dismal for you to hear all those numbers. But, as one of my friends said, Bill, your pancake frisker, it's like having another sense. You can't perceive the radiation. All you have are these numbers. Any other questions? Well, I got off easy.
Mr. Vollmann, thank you for speaking tonight. Let's give him a round of applause.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.